Ready? طيب. الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So last week, under the section regarding the manners and etiquettes prescribed by Islam in terms of our dealing with others, we spoke about the rights of parents and our duty to be kind to them and to avoid what we call al-uquq al-walidain, which is disrespecting, dishonoring, disowning the parents. So after the compilers of the book clarify the rights of parents and the danger of neglecting or intentionally violating their rights, the compilers then turn to the group of people whose rights follow those of parents in terms of priority and importance. So natural, I guess you could say, dissension. So basically, they start with the group of people who have the most right over us, and then they go to what? The next group of people, or the people who follow their right, or follow them in terms of their right over us. And so they follow up the discussion of the rights of parents with a discussion of those people, or that group of people, whose right over us follows their right in terms of priority and importance, and that is the blood relatives. The blood relatives. And the term commonly used by scholars who refer to blood relatives in Islam is al-Rahim or al-Arham. Al-Rahim or al-Arham, which literally means womb or wombs. And the usage of this word to refer to blood relatives is an allusion to the ties of kinship that result from marital relations and childbirth. And this topic has traditionally been discussed by the scholars either in terms of silat al-Rahim, silat al-Rahim, joining or maintaining the ties of kinship, which Islam obligates, or in terms of qatiyat al-Rahim, severing the ties of kinship, which Islam strictly forbids. So generally when this topic is discussed, either they'll be looking at it from the point of view of silat al-Rahim and how Islam obligates that, or qatiyat al-Rahim, severing the ties of kinship, and how Islam forbids that. And people, when Islam looks at, or when the scholars discuss individual Muslims in light of this topic, they will divide them into two categories. Either they will divide them into wasil, the one who joins the ties and maintains the bonds of kinship, or qati', one who severs, boycotts, and disowns. So basically what we intend to do in this session, inshallah ta'ala, is we hope to present what Allah and His Messenger have stated about this subject and comment on that material. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, what the Prophet said in the Hadith, and provide clarity through this commentary on how the guidance of the Quran and Hadith can best be practically applied. How can we fulfill the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fulfill the rights of our blood relatives and treat them in the way that Allah wants them to be treated. So we begin first and foremost by presenting some of those ayat and hadith which will clarify to us the status of family ties in Islam and encourage us to join them and warn us against severing them. So what has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran about silat al-Rahim, joining the ties of kinship, and qatiyat al-Rahim, severing the ties of kinship? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Nisa, the 4th surah of the Quran, the 36th verse, He says, وَاعْبُدُ اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا وَبِذِي الْقُرْبَى. He says, worship Allah alone and associate no partners with Him. Set up no rivals with Him in His worship. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, and be good towards your parents. وَبِذِي الْقُرْبَى, and kinsfolk. So as mentioned previously, in the ayah it does go on, and we mentioned previously, last time and the time before that this particular verse is known by the scholars, has been given a moniker by the scholars, a title by the scholars, which is Ayat al-Huquq al-Ashara. The verse which clarifies the 10 rights, or the 10 groups of people who are entitled to what? Rights from the believer. And in it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first mentions his right, the right of Allah. Then he follows it with the right, immediately he follows it with the right of the parents. And then he follows their right with the right of blood relatives. As if to indicate that there is no right more worthy of being fulfilled than his right. And then after his right, there is no right which takes precedence over the right of parents. And then after their right, no right is more sacred than the right of blood relatives. So basically this is to put us on notice that after the right of Allah and the right of parents, no one has more right over us than our blood relatives. ثم بعد ذلك, we have another ayah from Surah An-Nisa, the 4th surah, and it's actually the first verse in the surah. And in that verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامِ. He says, and fear Allah through whom you demand your mutual rights, and do not cut the relations of the womb. Allah has coupled, if you notice in this ayah, He couples the command to fear Him, wattaqullah, the command to fear Him, He couples it with the command to be kind and cordial towards one's relatives, and the prohibition of severing the ties of kinship. So in this way, He informs us that just as fulfilling His right is required, we have to fulfill His right, we have to fear Him. Likewise, the fulfillment of the rights of the parents is also mandatory, or the rights of relatives is also mandatory. It's almost as if He's saying, not only is it mandatory, but what? The two go hand in hand. That basically, fulfilling the rights of our relatives is part of an extension of fulfilling Allah's right. That we haven't really worshipped Allah the way we're supposed to, and feared Him, and been conscious of Him, if we're not mindful and we don't give the proper due to the rights of our relatives. But ثم بعد ذلك, in Surah Al-Ra'd, which is the 13th surah, verses 21 through 25. So it's a long portion of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He talks about both sides of the equation. He talks about those people who join the ties of kinship and what reward they will get, as well as those who sever those ties and what punishment they can anticipate. So I'll read to you in English to save time what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. He says, and those who join what Allah has commanded that it be joined, which means they maintain good relations with their kinfolk and do not sever the ties of kinship. And he goes on to mention other qualities that they have. Then he says, for such there is a good end. For such there is a good end. Then he describes what is that good end. He clarifies. He says, gardens of Eden. They shall enter, and along with them, those who acted righteously from among their fathers, and their wives, and their offspring. And angels shall enter upon them from every gate, saying, Salamun alaykum. Peace be upon you, for you persevered in patience. Excellent indeed is the final home. So this is how Allah describes those who join the ties of kinship. They're keen to keep their what? Their family relations. Then Allah goes on and He says, and those who break the covenant of Allah after its ratification, and sever that which Allah has commanded to be joined, i.e. they sever the bond of kinship, and do not treat their relatives well, and work mischief in the land, on them is the curse, and for them is a miserable end. So now if you notice in these ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He praises those who join the ties of kinship. They join the ties of kinship with their blood relatives by being kind to them in word and deed. The people who do this, Allah does what? He praises them first, and then He promises them paradise. And an additional reward and honor is that He will admit their family members along with them. So it's as if Allah is saying, by virtue of the good deed that you did, I'm going to reward you by what? Admitting you to paradise, and also what? Some of your what? Family members who maybe they don't deserve it. But I'm not doing it to reward them, but to honor and reward you. Because obviously when you go to paradise, you want to be with your family members. So they will get into paradise on what? On the coattails, so to speak, of this person who joined the ties of kinship. So Allah will give them additional reward and honor by allowing some of their family members to what? To join them in paradise. On the other hand, though, he threatens those who sever what? Sever the ties of kinship and disown their relatives or disregard their rights. He threatens them with a miserable end, and that means what? Punishment in the hellfire. So that lets you know that this is something very what? Serious. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to punish the person with hellfire for severing the ties of kinship, and on the other side, going to reward the person with paradise and what? Enter some of his family in there, it lets you know that what? Allah takes this matter very seriously. Another example from the Quran is Surah Muhammad, the 47th surah, verses 22 to 23, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَهَلْ عَسَيْتُمْ إِن تَوَلَّيْتُمْ أَن تُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَتُقَطِّعُوا أَرْحَامَكُمْ أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ لَعَنَهُمُ اللَّهُ فَأَصَمَّهُمْ وَأَعْمَى أَبْصَارَهُمْ. He says, would you then, if you were given the authority, do mischief in the land and sever your ties of kinship? Such are they whom Allah has cursed. So He has made them deaf and blinded their sight. Now I want you to contemplate again, because another verse which what drives home the point that Islam takes this matter very seriously. So first of all, Allah, He threatens those who sever the ties of kinship with a few things. Not just one thing, with a few things. First is what? His curse. Allah's not going to curse someone unless they do something which is what? An abominable sin. It has to be an abominable sin for Allah to curse them. So the first thing He threatens the person with, you sever the ties of kinship, I'm going to curse you. Okay? And the curse means what? That the person will be what? They will be removed from Allah's mercy. Or they'll be distanced from Allah's mercy. Then after that, He promises, He threatens them also with what? The deafening of their ears. And then thirdly, the blinding of their sight. Now the deafening of their ears, it means He will prevent them from what? Hearing the truth and benefiting from it. Okay? So He'll make them from the people who the truth will not reach them. Meaning that the truth, for example, is in the next room over, but for whatever reason they'll be too busy in what? In this room to go and into that room and hear the truth. Or there are books which contain the truth, but that person will never have access to those books or read those books. Or when someone is speaking the truth, their mind will be so preoccupied, or other people will be talking and they'll be preoccupied with that speech, they won't hear it. He'll cause them to be what? To be benefited from hearing the truth and benefiting from it. So if they do hear it, they won't benefit. It won't resonate. What did he say? I didn't get that. What? It won't what? Resonate. But as far as the sight, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends by the sight, He will blind their sight, is not the sight of the eyes. It's not the sight of the eyes, but rather the sight of the heart. And this means that Allah will disable the heart's ability to perceive and discern, such that the person will perceive falsehood as truth and truth as falsehood. So if he perceives, he won't perceive correctly. So what is truth, he'll perceive it as falsehood, and what is falsehood, he'll perceive it as truth. Now think about this. How can a person ever hope for any spiritual good to come to him if the paths have been what? Blocked. And what's the path for you to benefit from spiritual truth? You have to be able to what? Hear it, or what? Or recognize it with your heart. So if those two paths have been blocked, how can you receive any spiritual good? So as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying he will be denied all spiritual good. Why? If he does not join the ties of kinship. That's a pretty serious threat from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And all that indicates that severing ties of kinship and mistreating one's relatives is far from a small matter in Islam. It's not a light affair, which a lot of people do. They make a light affair of it. It also shows that nurturing these ties is an essential part of the Muslim character. It's part of being a good Muslim that you what? Join the ties of kinship with your relatives. So that's a few ayat on the subject, and now we'll turn to the ahadith. We'll turn to the ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on this matter. So the Prophet, of course, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he echoes the sentiments of Allah and further emphasizes the virtue and merit of nurturing blood relations, and has warned the Muslims in his hadith about neglecting them. So first of all, we have the hadith of Sufyan ibn Harb, Abu Sufyan Sakhr ibn Harb, collected by Bukhari Muslim, where he went to do some trading, and when he went to do this trading, I think he did it in Syria. And at that time, the Prophet had sent letters to some of the leaders of the non-Muslim nations, religious communities. And one of them, of course, was Hiraql, who was the leader of what? Rome, the Romans. So while they were in Syria doing their trading, and this letter had come to Hiraql, he wanted to know, was there anybody who was from that people, from the Arabs, who he could ask about the person who sent it, Muhammad. So it just so happened that Abu Sufyan and some of his companions from the Quraysh were doing some trade. So they were summoned. They were trading at that time, and they were summoned. So when they were summoned and they came, Hiraql proceeded to ask him 10 questions about the Prophet Muhammad to determine if he was. If he was indeed a prophet, and if there was any truth to the letter that he'd written. So one of the things he asked him, what does he order you to do? What is this prophet, what does he order you to do? So Abu Sufyan, Sakhr ibn Harb, he responds by saying, he commands us, I'budullaha wahdahu, wa la tushriku bihi shay'a. The first thing he tells us is worship Allah alone, do not associate any partners with Him in His worship. Watruku ma yaqulu aba'akum, and abandon what your Watruku ma yaqulu aba'ukum, and leave off, abandon what your ancestors used to do and what they used to say. Okay? Because it amounts to shirk. He commands us to pray, to speak the truth, to be chaste, and to maintain ties of kinship. So notice he closed it with the subject of our discussion, which is to maintain the ties of kinship. And what this teaches you, this hadith, alerts us that maintaining the ties of kinship is a fundamental aspect of the Islamic teachings, which was a point of emphasis of the Prophet ﷺ from the earliest days of his mission. Because you have to figure that Abu Sufyan is basing what he's telling about what the Prophet taught on what the Prophet taught when he was still in Mecca, living amongst them and preaching. So he's basing that on whatever the Prophet was preaching and calling to at that time. And he was teaching them, or what he was teaching them at that time, he's conveying, although some time has spanned, because the Prophet is now in Medina, or was at that time in Medina. So he's telling him that this is what he came with, this is what he taught us before what? Migrating to Medina. And so that tells you it's a fundamental aspect, something that the Prophet emphasized from what? From day one. Maintain the ties of kinship. But another hadith, also collected by Bukhari Muslim, this time on the authority of Abu Hurairah, the Prophet ﷺ informs us that Allah has made a promise to the womb, that He would join those who join its ties and cut off those who sever its ties. So in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Allah created the creation. And when He had finished creating them, the womb stood up and said. And we said that the womb, it represents what? The ties of kinship, the bonds of kinship, the ties that bind us. So He says, this is the stance of one seeking refuge from you from being severed. That's what the womb said to Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded and said, would it satisfy you if I were to join the one who joins you and cut off the one who severs you? The womb said, yes. Whereupon Allah said, and thus it will be for you. In another version of the hadith, collected by Bukhari Muslim as well, on authority of Aisha this time, she said, الرحم معلقة بالعرش تقول من وصلني وصله الله ومن قطعني قطعه الله. Kinship, الرحم, is suspended from the throne and says, Allah will connect with all who maintain my ties. Allah will sever His connection with all who sever my ties. So now contemplate this hadith, or these two hadith, and they teach you a few things. One, the status of these blood relations, these blood relatives. Because think about it, anything that hangs from the throne is something which is what? It's lofty, it's noble. It wouldn't be hanging from the throne unless it was what? It was noble, because the highest place in the dunya is what? is the throne, basically. The throne actually is the ceiling of what? The ceiling of what? The dunya, the world. So if something's hanging from it, it has to be what? Noble and high in status. So he says that the womb is what? Hanging, suspended from the throne. So that lets you know that this has a high place in the sight of Allah, that it would be what? Hanging from his throne. That's the first thing. The second thing is that our connection, come on, we're believers, we're Muslims, we're people who, we're Muslim for a reason. We want to be close to Allah, we want to have a connection with Allah. We want Him to be pleased with us. Our connection with Allah is predicated on what? Our connection with our relatives. So don't say, oh, I'm a Muslim and I want to be close to Allah. I want to be connected to Allah. I want to be joined by Allah. And then you're doing what? Cutting off the thing that will what? That will connect you to Allah. Right? So don't you want Allah to connect you? Of course we do. Then we should do what? Connect the ties of kinship. A third thing that you get from these two hadith is that the more a person connects himself to his relatives, the better relations he has with his relatives, the better he maintains these ties, the more keen he is to maintain them, then the stronger his bond with Allah will be. So sometimes what happens is that we feel like our bond with Allah is weak. And we're wondering why. Man, I'm making my salah. I'm reading Quran every day. I'm fasting Mondays and Thursdays. I'm getting up at night and praying at night. And you're just going down the checklist of things that you think will bring you closer to Allah and tighten that bond. And one of the things that we forget or we leave off is what? Is that tie of kinship. And so basically what the two hadith are teaching us is that, look, the closer you are to your relatives, the more you fulfill their rights, the stronger your bond with Allah will be. And as you start to do what? Let that bond between you and your relatives start to what? Deteriorate, diminish. Then also at the same time, your bond with Allah will do what? Will weaken and diminish. And so the stronger your relationship with your relatives, the stronger your bond with what? Allah. The weaker, and so on. So we have to think about that, ya ikhwan, when we're looking at our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the bond that we have with Allah, that in many cases predicated on what? Our relationship with our relatives. Another point from the Prophet is that our relationship with our relatives can either be our key to paradise or our ticket to the hellfire. Another thing you have to think about. That the bond that we have with our relatives can ultimately determine our station, our abode in the hereafter. And the proof for this, or one of the proofs for this, is the hadith, again, collected by Bukhari and Muslim, on the authority of Abu Ayyub, Khalid ibn Zayd al-Ansari, that a man said, Ya Rasulullah, akhbirni bi'amalin yudkhiluni al-jannah, wa yub'iduni an-nar. He said, O Messenger of Allah, inform me of an action that will enter me into the garden and keep me far away from the fire. Whereupon the Prophet ﷺ, he replied, تَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكْ بِهِ شَيْئًا وَتُقِيمُ الصَّلَاةِ وَتُؤْتِ الزَّكَاةِ وَتَصِلْ الرَّحِمِ. He said, worship Allah and do not associate anything with Him. Perform the prayer, pay the zakat, and maintain ties of kinship. So if you notice in this hadith, the Prophet was asked about what will get a person to paradise and keep them out of the hellfire. And this should be all of our goal. All of this should be all of our goal. And the Prophet, because of his care and concern, and his desire to what? Simplify the deen for the Muslims, he didn't give the person what? This long, exhaustive laundry list of things he had to do. He mentioned what? 4 things. Gave him a 4-point checklist. Do these 4 things and you'll enter paradise and be far away from the fire. The first one, worship Allah and don't associate partners with Him. Don't be a person of what? Don't be an idolater. Don't be a person who commits what? Shirk. So you go down the list, say, yeah, check, I'm a monotheist and I don't commit shirk. Right? Next one, tuqim as-salah. Establish the prayer. And that means that we try to do it in the best manner possible. And for men, the best manner possible means to what? To offer it in the masjid. And sometimes we all need what? A little encouragement from each other because it's easy to what? To kind of sit back and relax. But yeah, we want to try to make the prayer in the most perfect manner, and that means we're offering it in the masjid. وَتُؤْتِ الزَّكَاةِ. And you give what? The obligatory charity. So that's what? Check number 3. And then finally he said what? And you join the ties of what? Of kinship. These are the 4 things that if you do it, you'll enter the paradise and avoid the hellfire. And he mentioned among them what? Join the ties of kinship. We also have the hadith of Abu Muhammad Jubair ibn Mut'im, who reported that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, لا يدخل الجنة قاطع. He said, the one who severs the ties of kinship will not enter the garden, which means that cutting off ties with your relatives will prevent you from entering the paradise. That anytime we have a hadith that says لا يدخل الجنة, the person who does this won't enter paradise. That should be one of those things that we make it a point not to what? Not to do that thing, to avoid that thing. And one of those things is what? Severing the ties of kinship. We need to make sure we maintain those ties to avoid what? Preventing ourselves from entering the paradise, or creating an obstacle for ourselves to enter the paradise. فَثُمْ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ, these 2 hadith, they tell us that, look, the ties you have with your relatives can impact your hereafter, can affect your abode in the hereafter, where you're going to reside in the hereafter. But we need to also know that that the ties of kinship can also affect what? Our life herein. They can have either positive impact or negative impact on our life herein. And we find this supported by the hadith, again collected by Bukhari and Muslim, on the authority of Anas this time. Anas. In which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, مَنْ أَحَبَّ أَنْ يُبْسَطْ لَهُ فِي رِزْقِهِ وَيُنْسَأْ لَهُ فِي أَثَرِ فَلْيَسِلْ رَحِمًا. He says, he who desires that his provision be increased, or that his lifespan be extended, then let him maintain the ties of kinship. So basically, the quality and length of our life can be affected by the type of relationship we have with our relatives. If we have a good relationship with them, our lifespan can be extended, and our what? Our provisions can be what? Increased. Which is another thing, as we kind of mentioned earlier, that if my bond with Allah is weakening and I feel it getting weaker, I should look at what? My relationship with my relatives. Also, if a person's having a hard time making what? Ends meet. You might want to look at what? His relationship with what? His relatives. And finds that things are becoming difficult, it's hard to what? To take care of things. Perhaps that has something to do with the fact that we're cutting ties with relatives instead of what? Joining them, which is a cause for what? An abundance of rizq, provisions. That thumma ba'dalik, our blood relatives are more entitled to our charity and generosity than our non-relatives. And one form of ihsan, we've been told, like we mentioned earlier, that we've been told to do what? To be kind, respectful, and honor our relatives. One form of this ihsan, honoring them, being kind to them, is what? Is spending on them, being generous towards them, if we have the means. And also, this is also a type of what? Sila, maintaining the ties, as the scholars have mentioned. And giving them will garner a person a double reward. So a person will get rewarded twofold if they what? Are generous and charitable towards their relatives. The Prophet ﷺ, he said in the hadith, he said, "As-sadaqatu al-miskin sadaqa." He said, when you give charity to a poor person, you've given what? Charity. You've been generous. Okay? وَعَلَى ذِي رَحِمْ ثِنْتَانِ صَدَقَةٌ وَسِلَةٌ. He said, but to a relative, when you give charity to a relative, it is both sadaqah, it is both charity and act of generosity and nurturing the ties of kinship. So you're killing 2 birds with what? With one stone, right? You're killing 2 birds with one stone. Now the obvious question that comes down after we mention these ayat, these hadith that encourage us to join the ties of kinship and to avoid severing them. The obvious question that comes is, what deeds constitute joining the ties of kinship? How do we go about it? Practically speaking, what is considered joining and what is considered what? Cutting. Now what you're going to notice about this and all those hadith and all those ayat, you're going to see the command to what? To join the ties. Join the ties. Join the ties. But that's never followed with any specifics. It's never followed with any specifics. So Allah's messengers, they don't specify what deeds constitute the fulfillment of this command. They don't tell us how this command is supposed to be fulfilled, like do this or do that. And they don't affix a minimum amount of what? Of kindness or generosity that meets the requirement. They don't do that. Whenever that happens in Islam, when you're just told to do something, and you're not told the specifics about it, then what that means is that the specifics are left to what? Custom and tradition, what we call urf. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the Prophet, he said in the hadith, he said, "Man yu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir falyukrim dayfa." He said, whoever believes in Allah on the last day, let him honor his guest. So he commanded us to what? To honor the guest. But he didn't what? Didn't specify how to do that. So what that tells you, that honoring the guest is dictated, the true meaning of honoring the guest and how it's supposed to be fulfilled is dictated by the culture. And it's going to differ from what? From culture to culture, time to time, place to place, people to people. For example, if you came to my house, for example, and I'm going to host you, you're going to be my guest, right? And you sat down in the room, okay, and I put like a sufra, you know, like a piece of cloth or something for us to eat at, right? So we sit down, you're ready to eat, and I bring in a sheep, a live sheep, right? If I do that, I lay it down on the sufra, and I slaughter it right in front of you, and just blood splatters all over the place. What are you going to do? You're going to freak out. You're like, this guy's crazy. Is that not so? In our culture, you're going to say, this guy is crazy. But in other cultures, that is the most honorable way to honor a guest. That's like one of the best ways to honor a guest when you what? When you bring the sheep that you're going to serve him, and you slaughter it right in front of him to show him that what? This dhabiha, it wasn't something I bought from what? The store and had in the freezer, and since you were coming, I took it out. No. That basically this dhabiha, I'm going to prepare it just what? For you, to honor you as a guest. So you can see how one culture, the person would feel so honored by that. In another culture, the person would say, what is wrong with this person? I am out of here. Right? I don't want nothing. Not even a grain of rice. Right? So the point I'm trying to make is that similarly the case with maintaining the ties of kinship is going to be governed by what? The custom and tradition. That might differ. So there are going to be some things which all cultures will say this is what? Maintain the ties of kinship, being kind, honoring your relatives. But in other cultures, there might be things that people do that will be acceptable and not considered dishonoring them. And other cultures, a person, if they did that, they would be what? Considered to be what? Severing the ties of kinship. For example, in some cultures where, how can I put this? People are a little bit less connected. They're a little bit less connected. They're a little bit more spread out. And the way that you express your fellowship, your love, your commitment, your connection with someone is different. It might be acceptable for you to what? Call your relatives weekly, every 2 or 3 days. Send them an email every now and again, a few cards, and visit them maybe what? Once, twice, 3 times a year. And that might be considered what? Maintaining the ties of kinship, because we're always what? In touch. I'm always checking on you, but not physically in person, but maybe via other what? Means. That might be what? Acceptable. But in other cultures where people live closer together and much more personal contact is expected, then if you were to just call every now and again, and you didn't actually come and visit, you would be considered what? Severing the ties, or at least what? Not totally fulfilling the rights of your relatives. So that's going to differ from place to place and custom to custom, but what we have to do is be keen to what? To maintain the ties according to what? According to what is generally acceptable, and not to make excuses for behavior which is not acceptable. You guys understand what I mean by that? So that's the thing that we have to bear in mind, that if, for example, our aunts and uncles expect to see us, let's say we live in a different state, but it's a neighboring state, like North Carolina, for example. And they're expecting to see us, every few months. You'll come and just pay us a visit. Come for a weekend. That's what they're expecting. This is what our family culture dictates and demands. And you don't do that, but you call like I said, once a month or something, and they feel that what? You're pulling away, you're severing ties, then we shouldn't behave like that. We have to do what? We have to do whatever is culturally acceptable and expected, and is considered what? From connecting the ties, because it's dictated more by culture than it is by what? By the deen, because Allah and His Messenger did not specify. But by that, another issue which is important, we need to realize that joining the ties with relatives is not predicated on joining on them, join them as well. So, join the ties is not predicated. So, for example, let's say I have relative A. My joining the ties with relative A is not predicated on relative A join the ties with me. You guys understand that? Which means that basically I can't say, well, relative A he don't call me. Right? He doesn't visit me, so I don't have to visit him. That's not how it works in Islam. Okay? And the proof for this, there's a couple of hadith. The first one is a hadith collected by Muslim on the authority of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who reported that a man came to the Prophet and he said, O Messenger of Allah, I have some relatives with whom I maintain good relations, but they cut me off. I maintain the ties with them. I connect with them. But they what? They sever the ties. I am good to them, but they treat me poorly. Okay? I practice patience with them while they behave ignorantly towards me. Right? So, for example, they may do something which is rude and crude and harsh, and it hurts my feelings, and I do what? I pardon, I forgive, I don't make a big deal out of it. But then when I am kind to them, they respond to my kindness with what? With more harshness. Basically what he's saying. So the Prophet responded, he said, if you are as you have said, then it is as if you are feeding them hot embers. It is as if you are feeding them hot embers. You will continue to have a helper from Allah against them as long as you remain doing that. Okay? So as long as you continue to be kind to them, even though they are what? They treat you badly, they are rude and crude, they do harmful things, they hurt your feelings, etc. As long as you keep being kind to them in spite of that, it's as if they what? Are eating hot embers. And it says, and you will have a helper from Allah against them until what? And as long as you keep doing it. So what the hadith teaches us is that one, the mistreatment and transgressions of our relatives is no excuse for severing the ties. So nobody can say, oh, my father did this, my uncle did that, my cousin did this, okay, my sister did that. And then, so that as a result of that, they say, well, I have a right to not associate with them, to disown them. Doesn't work like that. Secondly, Allah supports the one who joins ties against the one who severs them. That Allah is going to be on your side, and going to support you and aid you against the people who what? Who hurt you and sever the ties. And finally, this hadith tells us that the consequence of greeting the kindness of relatives with cruelty. So you have a relative who treats you well, and you treat them poorly. The consequence of that is equivalent to eating hot ashes. It's like you are what? Eating hot ashes if you do that to one of your relatives. Have somebody who's always nice to me, but for whatever reason, I just what? I step on her. Every chance I get, I just step on her and step on her feelings, etc. Some people are like that. They need to realize that they're doing what? It's like they're eating hot ashes. And in Noah, he explained, he said, the sin that they will receive is equivalent to the pain experienced by the one who what? Who eats hot ashes. So if you say the pain is severe, then the sin they'll receive is what? Is severe. That's what he's trying to say. He said that's what Allah, the Prophet is indicating, is that they will receive a sin which is similar in severity and weight or intensity to the pain experienced by the one who actually ate what? Ate hot embers. And I don't know if anybody ever touched a hot coal and knows what that feels like, but imagine if that was in your what? In your mouth, and the pain you would experience from that. We have another hadith along those lines. That's the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, a person who maintains ties of kinship in Islam is not someone who only does so with those who maintain ties with him. A person who truly maintains the ties of kinship is someone who restores them when they've been cut off. And this is hard, some of us have maybe experienced this, is that when you have somebody who you try to join the ties of kinship with them and they do what? They cut them off. They tell you to go about your merry way. I don't have anything to say to you, etc. And no matter how much you try to extend your hand, not only do they not extend their hand, but they will do what? They'll insult you, they'll curse you, they'll mistreat you. The easiest thing to do then is say, what? Whatever then. Forget it. Okay? And you say, well, I'm a wasim. I'm a person who maintains the ties. Because these people who, they extend their hand to me, I extend my hand to them. And you think by that, by virtue of that, you're a wasim. The Prophet says, la. The wasim, the one who connects the ties, is the one who keeps what? Extend his hand, even though the other person does what? Slaps it away. You guys understand that? Okay? And again, that's not easy. That's not easy to do. But not everything in Islam is easy. But it is going to what? It's always going to pay off. It's always going to pay off. So in this hadith, the Prophet, he refutes a misconception. And that is that joining the ties is tantamount or equivalent to reciprocating. And that there's no harm if I disassociate with people who initiate the severing of ties. Look, they're the ones who cut the tie. So I'm just what? I'm just rolling with it. No. That we have to what? We have to understand that this hadith is telling us that the true indication of a person who is a wasil, the one who connects, the true definition, is the one who makes every attempt to maintain the tie, even though he has relatives who are determined to what? To sever it. So he tries to maintain it. So that's how it is in Islam. That's the definition of a wasil. The wasil is not the one who, if they extend, I extend. No. The wasil is the one who, when they're what? Slapping his hand away, he still what? He still extends. And I know it's not hard, Ikhwan, but not everything in Islam is easy, but again, it will pay big dividends. Allah's promise is true. Last but not least, the most excellent example that we have in everything in the deen, including the joining of ties of kinship, is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we want to close with a hadith which shows the Prophet's commitment to this maintaining of ties. And that the Prophet was not a person who would tell people to do something that he wasn't prepared to do himself. But he would be the first one to set what? The most excellent example in how to do whatever he commanded others to do. So in the hadith of Abu Abdullah, Amr ibn al-As, he said, I heard the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, the people of Banu so-and-so, and he mentioned this tribe, are not my friends and allies. Laysu bi awliya. Laysu bi awliya li. They are not what? They are not my friends and allies. My friends are Allah and the righteous believers. But they are my kinsmen, and I will honor that kinship. Now, if you notice, or it's kind of indicated in the hadith, that the members of this tribe, they were pagans. That's why the Prophet said they're not what? Awliya. Because as we spoke about previously, we discussed the Muslim creed and commented on it. We said that those who are entitled to al-wala, allegiance, friendship, and loyalty, are what? Allah, His Messenger, and the believers. So whoever's not in that list, then they're entitled to what? Al-bara, disavowal, disallegiance, and enmity. So the Prophet is saying that, look, because they're pagans, they're not entitled to what? My loyalty, my friendship. They're not my friends. My friends are what? Allah and the believers. But at the same time, he says that just because they were not believers, they're still entitled to what? They're still entitled to the honor, respect, and kindness that comes with what? Being relatives. So he says, but they are my kinsmen. So just because I'm not going to have friendship with them, they're not going to be my allies, doesn't mean that I'm not going to give them their right, their due, in accordance with what? The kinship that we share. So this hadith teaches us, that we are required to join ties even with non-Muslims, non-Muslim relatives, And we're prohibited from severing ties with them. So what happens sometimes is that people that they come to Islam, they have a lot of zeal. And they hate what their relatives do of what? Associating partners with Allah. So they may go visit their relatives, big dinner, everybody's at the table, and he'll say, maybe he'll preach to them, he'll talk to them about Islam, call them to Islam. They won't listen, they won't accept. They'll keep going on about Jesus and the Trinity, etc. They'll get angry. And he'll say, man, I'm not going to fool with you guys until what? Till you accept Islam. I'm not going to associate with you guys. You're not a Muslim. And he'll storm out. And people do this. This actually happened. And they'll actually cut off and disassociate with their relatives because they consider them what? Mushrikun, kuffar, etc. And all that's true, except what? His application of that. Yeah, they're kuffar, they're mushrikun. But how does a Muslim deal with them? Does he cut them off if they're his relatives? No, he doesn't do that. But rather he does what? He maintains ties with them and honors them and treats them kindly. Realize that's part of what? Part of the deen. Part of what's required. Now think about this. If this is the case with the non-Muslim, if this is the case with non-Muslim relatives, it's going to be even truer, even more the case with what? With sinful Muslim relatives, right? Because they're still what? Muslim. So what happens too sometimes is people will say, for example, well, I don't associate with that cousin of mine because he doesn't pray, okay? Or he prays sometimes. Or because he does X, or because he smokes, or whatever. So even if he's sinful, we have to do what? Maintain the ties of kinship. Because the maintaining of the ties is not predicated on them being perfect. It's predicated on them being what? Relatives. And they'll never cease being what? They'll never cease being relatives until they die. So that's based on our presentation on the subject of nurturing the ties of blood relationship. If you guys have any questions, any comments or complaints, we'll take those. Hada wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala nabi Muhammad. Anything? Any questions? Any comments? Any complaints about it?
You said the family to enter the Jannah, like the family to keep the ties with, and you could like enter them into Jannah with you?
Well, I don't know if it's the ayah doesn't say that you will enter them, but Allah, as an additional reward and honor, He will enter them.
But that doesn't like.
And that won't include non-Muslims.
That won't include
no, it won't include non-Muslims because obviously the condition for them being included would have to be what? The basic minimum condition of being believers, people who have what? Accepted, embraced the Shahada. Yeah.
Alright, like with your children, as far as like, they might have non-Muslim relatives.
Hey.
Is it wise for you to, like, not necessarily keep the ties, you know what I mean, but like if they was to invite them, oh, we having like a dinner, 4th of July, whatever, you know what I mean, stuff like that.
Hey.
They want the children to come. Would that be a form of severing the ties by not allowing them to go?
No, because you have another consideration, and that's the fact that Islam does not permit us to participate in non-Muslim holidays, right, to partake in that. So basically, that's going to supersede.
Yeah,
and there are other ways to.
Not necessarily if there's a holiday, like just they want to spend time with them.
Well, I mean, sure, they
you
can
know that it'll be a bad influence for your child.
And like, okay, this is like one of those things you have to try to balance, because what you can't do is in a roundabout, indirect way sever the ties and then justify it by what we're worried about their influence. Because the fear of being a negative influence can be mitigated in a number of ways. For example, when you take the children to spend time with their grandparents, for example, or their aunts and uncles, you could be what? You could be there, and you can say, hey, we don't do that. Hey, we don't, etc. You can set, conditions, and set rules, okay? They don't eat this. They don't watch this. They don't. Now,
people Christian, you send them over.
Now, and if that happens,
why your daddy make you?
And if that happens, and then you deal with that accordingly. So let's say, for example, like you said, they were to try to influence the child in the terms of, do you really believe in that? And that your father's religion? Do you really believe in that stuff? They were to say that to the child, or try to influence the child. Like you said, criticize what the child is wearing, criticize the fact the child goes off and prays, whatever. then you would deal with that accordingly. Okay, so basically, we brought the child because we wanted to maintain the ties of kinship, and then you did something which we feel is an affront to our beliefs. So from now on, we'll never leave him with you. We'll bring him to spend time because we're going to join those ties of kinship, but we'll never leave him with you. You've lost that privilege because you showed that you can't be trusted. So again, like I said, we have to be keen to maintain the ties, and at the same time keen to protect our children from these negative influences. So we kind of try to combine the best of both worlds and not feel like we have to do one or the other. No, we reconcile between the two of them. Any other questions? Any question? Going once? Going twice? هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.